Hey everyone, welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris.
And I am Mike.
And you can go to our website, which is versebyversebibleteaching.com. Today we're going through the book of Galatians, and we're in chapter 4. We're starting off at verse 11. Mike, do you have an intro for us?
I do. We are actually, as Chris said, we are going through Galatians, and we're at 4 verse 11 right here. Paul started an appeal to the Galatians in verse 8. And he's going to continue with that appeal, and that is the text. The basic thrust is to reconsider their actions. Paul wants the Galatian believers to reconsider their actions here, and that's really what from 11 through I guess about 20 or so is where we're gonna leave off at the end of this, and that's going to take us up there. So that's what we're doing here now, and let's just jump right into it. Galatians chapter 4. Verse 11, I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. So Paul begins to shift here to what I call the language of weakness. This verse is really a pivot point from his doctrinal defense of the gospel to a more personal approach. All throughout the previous parts of the book of Galatians, Paul has up until this point been using strong, sometimes harsh language to describe those who are opposing the gospel of grace, those who oppose the gospel of Jesus. Listen to some of what Paul has previously said, just look at the strong language overall. Galatians chapter 1, verse 6, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turned to a different gospel. Galatians chapter 2, verse 5 reads, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. Then again in Galatians chapter 2 verse 6 he says, and from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. And finally, Galatians 2 verse 11, but when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. Further, Paul's defense of the gospel of grace was strident. That's as much his labor and striving here as he's talking about here in verse 11, which is exactly, here, I guess I should clarify that. In verse 11, he's beginning he's ending the strident defense and going with, like I said, the language of weakness, the presentation of the gospel of grace now from friendship tones. As far as being right with God, the gospel was an all or nothing thing. It's either the gospel of grace or nothing else, for nothing else will reconcile us to God. And as I said, after being in stride in many places to his audience and their fall from grace, Paul begins to change his words here. In the next verse, he's going to come back to ask them to come back, that he wasn't offended them at all, but for now he's afraid that he may have labored over them in vain. Chris?
That's really good. One more I would add to that is... O ye foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?
Yeah, I know. That's a really good one too.
Well, this word that he labors, he's afraid he may have labored in vain. That word there in the Greek for labor is kopia. I don't know. I've never pronounced these Greek words right. It means to work to the point of exhaustion. And Paul had worked very hard in his missionary trip in the region of Galatia. As we see all over the book of Acts, we see he got stoned there to death, or around that region. And I also think that he probably worked pretty hard, because we see in context that the Galatians might have been a little hard-headed, but we can only infer that, obviously. He's worried that his labor was all for nothing. That's really why Paul is writing this letter, because he sees this is a continued part of his ministry to the Galatians. It was not good enough to just convert them and to run off and go do other things to him, but to disciple them and to contend against the false prophets for them. It was labor and continued labor that he had. The Great Commission, as you know, is not purely about evangelism, but it also says to make disciples of all men. So evangelism is certainly included in that, don't get me wrong, but many of us in the body have gifts for evangelism, but to stay with them and make sure that the seed is firmly rooted and is getting plenty of water and sunlight and all that stuff is just as crucial. I also see this verse as a defense, kind of in apologetic tones. Paul is writing a letter here to refute by like a point-by-point refutation to the false teachers. He uses examples from his life and from their life and all kinds of proof texts from the Scripture. So one might even say that Paul was debunking the false teachers with this letter to the Galatians. Mike?
Interesting point. Debunking. I like that word. Let's go on to let's go on to verse 12 here. Galatians chapter 4, verse 12. Brothers, I entreat you, become as I am, for I also have become as you are. You did me no wrong. Paul is using a personal approach to his audience. He is, in a sense, laying any personal feelings aside he may have had of guilt or hurt or disgust over his Galatian brethren. He is asking them back to the fold. He's asking, come back, guys. Come on back in the pool. The water is warm. He mentions this again in a similar matter when dealing with other folks in 2 Thessalonians 3, 14 and 15. And if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed. Yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. Paul puts it perhaps a little more eloquently in the second letter to the Corinthians. For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. Now if anyone has caused pain, he has caused it not to me, but in some measure, not to put it too severely, to all of you. Paul tried as hard as he could to be a reconciler to his Christian brethren. Even though Paul's letters are obviously full of sometimes, to us, very complicated theology, he never lost sight of looking at his brothers, even ones that were head over tea kettle messed up, with love. Paul writes, brothers, become as I am, for you did me no wrong. Further, Paul mentions here that he has also become as you are. This seems to indicate that Paul's willingness to live as the people around him was something that he more than just talked about. He wanted the gospel message to go forward and become something something that everybody could see and live. And I'll just leave it there. Chris?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. Now, I was trying to struggle with this for a while. This he says, brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. And
interesting
commentaries
quote, isn't
it? Yeah. I know. I was reading the different commentaries. They were all kind of saying different things about it. I mean, it's not really technically a big deal, but it is sort of hard to figure out. But
it is if you can't really come to a conclusion.
Right. Well, yeah. I think I came to one based off of Chuck Missler had a pretty good point for this. I think that it's a pretty close rendering of what it may be meaning. He's emphasizing the verbs for to be here, like am and are. So maybe it would be read, brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. What he's saying is, be like me, not living under the law of Moses, for I am now, by grace of God, what you as Gentiles are already. You're already free from the law. They, for the most part, were Gentiles in Galatia, and he was saying, hey, you are Gentiles. Why don't you become like me? After all, what I became is what you already are. Gentiles not under the law of Moses. Now that might not be the right interpretation. There's certainly, but it's such a minor issue. But just taking a stab at it. That ye have not injured me at all. This is where Paul, as you have been mentioning, starts to really show the heart of a pastor that he had for the Galatians, and what a wonderful gift that is to have, a great big grandfatherly pastor's heart, and that's a really rare thing. And Paul is assuring them that he is not mad at them and in a personal way, and that he will begin to remind them of the love they once had for him in the next few verses. Mike?
Good stuff.